Recording.
Okay. How are you guys doing?
Good, and you?
Good. Good. So let's go ahead and kind of pick up where we left off. So we were talking about Twitch and Twitch curves. And one of the things that I wanted to do was actually show you a Trepa curve. So you can see here, I kind of pulled this one off. That was kind of a good one that had a comparison of our Twitch curve. So here you can see you've got a nice Twitch curve. This is kind of like a normal Twitch curve. So you have your contraction followed by your relaxation. And then you come down to rest and you kind of reset yourself and you do another contraction, another relaxation. And so with Trepa, what's happening is you basically are doing the stimulus kind of more in rapid fire. So for instance, these little hash marks right here is the points of stimulation where you're going to kick in the new contraction. And then here you can see you've got a more frequent amount of stimulation. So it's not so fast that you can't relax. So you can see from your Twitch curve that you are contracting. So here's your contraction, and then you're maxing out, and then you're allowing time to fully come down to relaxation. But instead of having this like little shoulder piece down here, this kind of interval in between your next stimulus and your next twitch, you're basically like as soon as you hit that relaxation, boom, you hit the next twitch. And so you don't have any lag time in between the twitches. And so this is kind of what Trepa is. So what this does is basically it kind of starts to prime the muscle. And then you can see that your contraction peaks start to get bigger and bigger and bigger. And so that's kind of what we're looking at when we see Trepa. Okay, so let's go ahead and keep taking a look and working on our frequency of action potential. So basically when we go beyond Trepa, so this is kind of like when you're giving, it's like as fast as you can go, as many twitches as you can get with full contraction followed by full relaxation. So you're allowing full amount of relaxation. What happens if you go faster? Well, if you have faster, what's going to happen is ultimately you're going to start cutting into the relaxation piece. And this is kind of where we start to get the increase in the frequency of your contractions. And so what happens is you start to add one contraction to the next. So you have this summation of contraction force as you basically kind of move up. So essentially the contractions basically build and increase off of each other. Oftentimes it's associated with a reduced time provided for relaxation. And so we'll see that here in just a second. Now, incomplete tetanus is basically where the muscle fibers will have a little bit of relaxation in between contraction, but not full contraction. And then with complete tetanus, there's no relaxation between contractions. Ultimately, when you get wave summation and tetanus, this is basically happening because the actual twitch piece is lasting longer or takes longer than the electrical events. Remember, this is what we mean by electrical events. What we're talking about here is the depolarization, repolarization events. So when that's happening, it takes a little bit longer. Like for instance, if the relaxation is taking a little bit longer than the time for the next depolarization, that will basically allow your action potentials to kind of stack up, for lack of a better term. And then basically that is kind of like starting to overlap into the amount of time that it takes for a single twitch. So essentially what's happening is the electrical events of the next twitch are actually kind of intruding upon the components of the previous twitch. So you're not allowing the previous twitch to run its full course. And so one of the things when you look at this sort of mechanically, we talked a little bit about this last time as well. So one of the things you'll oftentimes see is that the calcium ions themselves, remember, those were released by the sarcoplasmic reticulum. And so these calcium ions will not be removed sufficiently. And so that means you're kind of in a partial state of contraction. So when you're unable to relax, it means you're kind of in a state of partial contraction. And this is for when you start the next contraction. So rather than being fully at rest, you're kind of partially contracted because you're not able to complete that full cycle. So that's kind of what it looks like. So this is basically where you have a single action potential that kind of comes in. So you can see there's a stimulus there. There's another one there. There's another one there. There's another one there. And so you're allowing for complete contraction as you go up and then complete relaxation as you go down. So contraction as you go up and relaxation as you go down. So you're allowing it to go to full relaxation. So you're allowing for complete relaxation. That's what's happening in this particular one, this first frequency. The second frequency, your stimuli are coming so fast that you'll first get your stimulus here and you'll get your contraction curve, but you don't allow it to relax sufficiently until your next stimulus hits it. And then basically it's going to climb up and it's going to contract again. And then you're going to hit it again. So here's another one, and here's another one, and here's another one. And so this is going to start to create this sort of sawtooth look where you have these little mini contractions. But you do have a little bit of relaxation. This is what's called wave summation. So basically the action potentials will increase. There's only a small bit of relaxation before the next action potential fires off. So you don't really have a chance to do a whole lot. There's kind of like a little bit of a let down, but you can see here in this area, the waves are summing together to basically create a plateau. So they're kind of like adding together. And that's wave summation. That's sort of climbing up the original hill until you kind of get up to that point where you get that sawtooth effect where you have a little bit of relaxation, but not full relaxation. So incomplete tetanus basically is when you have continued stimulation in this pattern. And basically what you start to have is prolonged. So the idea of, so it looks a lot very similar, right? So a lot of you will probably notice that the front end of wave summation looks an awful lot like trepa. The ruffled piece looks an awful lot like complete tetanus. So the difference between the front end of wave summation and trepa is the fact that with wave summation, you're moving on to a rapid fire kind of a stimulus where you're not allowing for relaxation. In trepa, you're allowing for complete relaxation. So you're going through your completely relaxation cycle. So in incomplete tetanus, the reason why it's a little different from the area of wave summation or the top part of wave summation is in its duration. So basically, if this little ruffling kind of mini contractions is enduring, if it endures for a period of time, then it becomes incomplete tetanus. And so you can see you basically have fairly constant tension. You're sort of ruffling back and forth. You're kind of going up and then down just a little bit, and up and down and up and down, but you have constant contraction, essentially what you have. And then in complete tetanus, basically they are so rapid that there's no relaxation at all. So if there's no relaxation, then all you get is basically total contraction. So it's like just completely frozen, totally contracted, and kind of like frozen muscles, so to speak. That's for lack of a better way to describe it. So they're completely seized up at this point. That's what's happening with complete tetanus. And so they'll have continuous contraction without relaxation. That's the definition of tetanus. So then when we take a look at muscle fiber diameter, the greater the diameter, the greater the force the muscle will generate. We talked a little bit about this last time. Remember, we said that your muscles don't increase in number. That is to say, number of muscle fibers. You have the same muscle fibers you've always had. They increase in diameter. And so if you have a greater diameter muscle, then you basically, or a muscle fiber, then you essentially have more myofibrils where you can produce more force. And so the diameter of a muscle fiber is all about building more and more of these myofibrils. So the more myofibrils you build in your muscle fiber, the more cross bridges you can make, which produces more force of contraction. This is one of the reasons why when you build out your muscles, you tend to have the ability, or you tend to be stronger, and you can apply more force to a particular load. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at active tension and passive tension and total tension. So we're going to be taking a look at sort of the consequences of the applied force or the shortened muscle. So an active tension is basically the force that's applied to an object, which is oftentimes referred to as your load, but it's due to the contraction of the muscle itself. So it's the active tension that will change depending on the muscle fiber length. So the active tension will increase or decrease as the muscle fiber changes in length. And so that gives you an active tension curve plotted with tension versus the length of the muscle. So we'll see that in the next plot. So now if you stretch it too far, then you're essentially making the zone of overlap between myosin and actin. You're sort of eliminating some contact of myosin heads with actin because it's kind of off the end of the chart, so to speak. And so it won't be able to overlap or to grab onto a an actin rather. And so that would be a situation where you're stretched beyond your means. And so the thick filaments, the myosin, won't have any actin to grab onto. So it'll be kind of off the end. If you recall, the actin looks something like this, where the myosin heads are supposed to overlap. But if you stretch this too far this way, what's going to happen is you're going to get an actin filament where some of these heads are off the end. And so you're not going to be able to get as much strength because these are not going to be able to attach and pull on the actin because they're not in that zone of overlap. So you don't want to stretch it too far. But the other thing is you don't want to not stretch it right? Because you have to basically restore sort of maximum distance between your Z disks so that you can get maximum overlap. So if it's too close or too far, you won't get maximum overlap. So that's active tension. So the more overlap you have between myosin and actin, the more tension you'll be able to make. So passive tension is a force or a tension that's applied to the load. That's the object you're trying to lift. When the muscle stretches, but itself is not stimulated. So basically, when you take a look at the two, you get total tension, which is a sum of active and passive tension. So kind of an innate tension versus an applied tension. So this is kind of what it looks like, the muscle length versus tension curve. So you'll see the tension percentage as a percentage of your total tension, and the percent of resting sarcomeric length. So it's the length of the sarcomeres, right? So basically what you're going to see is you have an optimum length. So if you are down in area number 1, that basically means you're in this particular area. And so what's happening is you're too close. So if you notice, there's no more room to pull the thin filaments because you've already pulled them close to maximum length. So it's already maximally shortened. You can't do anymore. And so if you have a sarcomere that's not fully relaxed, then it will not fully contract. In this case, you see the muscle length is short. And so basically you contract with a certain amount of tension and then you relax over time. And then if you take, I want to skip over to 3, because when you have number 3, you notice you have a decline in tension relative to the percent of the sarcomeric length. In this case, if you notice, your region of overlap here has been greatly reduced. You got a lot of myosin heads here that are just sort of hanging off the end. So it's not in contact with the actin, so it can't grab onto anything. So in this case, basically, you're talking about being too stretched, too long. So you can see how long it is, how elongated it is. So since it's too long or too stretched, you don't have all these heads attached maximally to actin. And so what's going to happen is you're going to get a very, very small amount of tension because simply your actin is simply not going to be able to make contact with those myosin heads. And so as a result, you can see the twitch curve, very weak contraction here, followed by a relaxation. That's because you simply just can't grab onto enough actin to shorten those sarcomeres yet up. So you're basically extended too far. You're too far stretched out. Now the sweet spot is right here in the middle. This is where you're going to get kind of somewhere in between. So you're only going to get roughly a certain kind of a sweet spot number or percentage of resting sarcomeric length. So the actual distance of the sarcomeric length relative to the entire sarcomere. This is going to be section number 2, where you have maximal tension Notice. And so this is basically, if you notice, your zone of overlap is really good. It's fully connected. With some room to slide, right? The sliding filaments. So you have room here, right on the ends of the actin to slide. So you have maximal connection of your myosin heads because you have good overlap, and you have room to slide those actins in. So what's going to happen is you're going to be able to shorten your muscle, and you're going to get a good strong contraction because you're maximally stretched with a good strong relaxation. And so that's why it's important not to overextend your sarcomeres. It's important also to stretch your sarcomeres out. So you want to make sure that you have them maximally and optimally stretched out. So now when you take a look at contraction of the whole muscle, you can actually have variations, right? So that's basically what it means by graded. So there's variations in contraction. So you can have very weak contractions, you can have very strong contractions, you can have all kinds of stuff in between as well. And so the reason and how you generate this or how you do this is through recruiting motor units. So there's this idea of recruitment in your muscles where you basically will recruit motor units as needed. So you're recruiting as those motor units are needed. So the strength of your contraction will require you to recruit motor units to help you out with the load. And so a typical muscle will, remember, have all of these muscle fibers organized and broken up by motor units, each of which is innervated by a motor neuron. And so your ability to recruit motor units to do the job is basically will allow you to be able to create a nice strong contraction. Let's go ahead and take a look at this. So here, you have your stimulus down here in the black arrows plotted against tension, and we're looking at a twitch curve. So ultimately, you'll have a called sub-threshold stimulus where there's no motor units respond. And then you'll start to have a threshold of stimulus where one unit will respond. So you get a little bit of a contraction and then a relaxation. And then with the next stimulus and the next one and the next one, you can see how you're starting to increase in your direction. So this is basically where you have what's called submaximal stimuli. So you have an increasing number of motor units that are starting to respond. You're recruiting them. That's basically what's happening. You're getting them fired up and ready to roll. And as you increase your stimulus, then you're going to get to your peak. That's going to be your maximal stimulus where all your motor units have been recruited. And at that point, you basically are going to see the same contraction at the same level. And so once you get past that maximal stimulus where you've achieved maximum contraction, from then on, it's called supramaximal stimuli. So all the motor units that are going to respond have responded, and then basically they just maintain this sort of contraction. You've reached maximum contraction. So this is basically increasing in strength because you start off with this kind of curve where you're recruiting motor units in order to work on the load. This is basically how you get a situation where you pick something up, and at first you only have a little bit of contraction in your muscle, and then it increases and increases and increases until you're able to pick up the object. And that's basically because you're recruiting these motor units successfully over time. Your muscles are being told to contract but you're adding more and more motor units to the load so that you can pick it up. So the subthreshold stimulus basically is where you have no action potential and therefore you have no contraction. Once you get to threshold, you'll have achieved your action potential. You get to the action potential threshold, and that's going to stimulate the contraction. So you begin by seeing the contraction. That's this little guy right here. Okay, it's not much because you've only recruited, 1 or 2 motor units. Then the submaximal stimuli is stronger stimulus, and it's producing action potentials in the axons, but it's basically recruiting more motor units, and so it's getting stronger and stronger. And that's why these guys are slowly starting to incline, because you're starting to recruit more and more of these motor units until you get to your max concentration, your max stimulation, where the action potentials basically have recruited all of the motor units in a muscle. So if you have even more stimulus, that's super maximal stimulus, there's no effect because you've already reached your max. This is your plateau. Okay, let's go ahead and take a look at the size concept that we see here. So basically during recruitment, normally what will happen is the small motor units are recruited first, followed by the large ones. The idea here being that essentially you want the smallest number of muscles that do the job, whatever your job is that you're doing. And so if you only need a few motor units to get the job done, then you only want to activate and recruit a few small motor units. If it looks like you're going to have to bring in the big guns to really put some power into it, then you're going to successfully recruit that. But you're going to start off first. You're going to start off with the little stuff, because the idea is we need to make sure that we don't just go for the big units and basically recruit everything. We want to make sure we start off small first so that we can match our motor unit tension to the tension that's being or the force that's being produced by the load that we're picking up. In terms of muscle tone, this is basically a situation where you have a constant low level tension of the muscles for long periods of time. And this is because you have a very small number of motor units that are contracting sort of out of phase with each other. What that basically means is they kind of rotate from one to the other. And so what this does, what this low level of constant tension gives you, is this creates a state of readiness of the muscle, making it more efficient to contract. Think of it this way. If I wanted you to run a sprint, like the 100-meter, like in the Olympics, right? A sprinting speed. Would you get better results running your sprint if you were starting from a laying down position, or from a position where you're on your feet and you're crouched forward, ready to go? Yeah, so on your feet, right? Because if you watch the Olympics, they kind of get, on your mark, get set. So they kind of get to their mark, they get themselves set, they crouch down, their muscles are ready to explode out of the gate. That's like muscle tone. So what that means is you're in a more kind of a stable, constant state of tension. Your muscles are kind of, they're kind of like rippling and vibrating. They're ready to go. They're ready to basically start contracting so that you can get a really good fast start and an efficient contraction and a nice fast race, as opposed to just basically jumping up from a laying down position, in which case your body is not ready at all. Right. So, I mean, you're just like, it's tragic. You hurt yourself. Right. I mean, have you ever done that? Have you ever like been startled in your sleep by something or somebody? And it's like you were just so at rest. And then all of a sudden, something just scared the devil out of you. And you woke up so hard that it's like it kind of hurt. And then you get to go into work the next day and you're like, what's your problem? And you're like, oh, I just pulled a muscle. Really? How'd you do that? I woke up. Right. So that's like what it's like to not be toned. By the way, the tonal idea is an important one to understand, because just like there's muscle tone, there's also physiological tone that you guys will probably run into in AMP2. Okay. Let's go ahead and take a look at the types of isotonic contractions. So first of all, remember, isotonic, just to remind you, is basically a situation where we have a muscle that changes in length, but the tension stays constant. Right. So that's basically the isotonic sort of situation. And so there's a couple of different types. So there's what's called concentric, where essentially the muscles will overcome the opposing resistance and the muscle shortens. Right. So the shortening. And then there's eccentric, where the tension is maintained, but the opposing resistance on the muscle is big enough to cause the muscle to lengthen. So you're looking at the response in the contraction strategy, whether or not it's shortening or lengthening relative to what the actual resistance is doing. So there's a lot of kind of biometrics associated with body movements as you're looking at both a combination of the resistance that's being applied to the muscle and then the counter force that the muscle is then applying to the resistance. And so there's actually quite a bit of biophysics when you start looking at the biomechanics of motion and movement in the body, which is something that you get into in a lot more detail when you take things like kinesiology and stuff like that. Okay, so let's take a look at the different types of twitch. So when you take a look at twitch, so you have slow twitch and fast twitch. So type 1 versus type 2. Now, recall, slow twitch is going to be a more slow type of a twitch. We talked about these a little bit a while ago. They tend to be smaller in diameter. They tend to be rich in blood. They have more mitochondria, that's for energy. They tend to resist fatigue. So basically, these are your endurance muscles relative to fast twitch. And they have a large amount of myoglobin. So myoglobin basically binds to oxygen very strongly and doesn't want to let it go. So it's a really good source of stored oxygen. So because this is a vascular type of muscle, these slow twitch types are basically the red meat, right? So this is basically your red meat. Excuse me. Dark meat. So if you're looking at like poultry, you dark meat or versus white meat situations, that's basically what you're looking at. You're looking at slow twitch versus fast twitch muscle. So good examples are long, enduring types of musculature, postural muscles in the back, for instance, and in the upper and lower limbs. So stability, long-term contraction, things that are necessary in the long haul. These are the marathon runners of the muscles. The fast twitch is a little bit different. By the way, if you take a look at this, we were looking at this in terms of diameter and the number of muscle fibers that you have in a motor unit. We talked a little bit about it first there. But if you're in an endurance game, this is one of the reasons why you have a rich blood supply. Why do you have rich blood supply? Because you supply oxygen and nutrients, both of which are necessary for mitochondria. Mitochondria makes energy, which you can then feed to your muscles so that they can maintain this level of activity over a long period of time. Okay. So it's all about endurance. Everything about the slow twitch is basically for endurance purposes. Fast twitch, this is your sprinter muscle, right? So they're going to be a very rapid type of muscle. They typically are stimulated by nervous stimulation. They have a type of myosin that can break down your ATP much faster than type 1. They don't have a lot of blood supply in them. They have fewer, and the ones they do have are smaller mitochondria, so there's not as much energy. And that's relative to slow twitch. And so most of your metabolic sources basically are fed not by mitochondria, which is aerobic, that's typically aerobic, but it's mostly energy comes from anaerobic sources oftentimes. And typically these are quickly depleted. This is one of the reasons why you can't run at sprinter level speeds for like a mile, because what's fueling your body at sprinter level speeds, like a cheetah, is anaerobic molecules. And so there's a very limited supply of those because that's not the way our metabolism is wired. And so we will crash, we metabolically crash. We can't maintain that level of speed for very long. And so as a result, if you're anaerobic, you don't need mitochondria. And if you don't have mitochondria because you're anaerobic, you don't need a lot of blood supply because you don't need the oxygen and the nutrients in order to fuel the mitochondria that you don't have. And so everything is very quick and very fast. However, they can be quite powerful. So this is like your sprinter, right? Your sprinter muscles, your lower limbs, your upper limbs. This is because they don't have a lot of blood in them. This is the white meat of poultry because there's not a lot of blood in there. And so all of your energy is going to be in this anaerobic pathway. So normally when you're working out, right, I mean, there's certain types of activities that you utilize. For instance, if you're playing football, when you're running a play, the wide receiver is running and running fast. It's a sprint, right? So the wide receiver is mostly using fast twitch muscles. And so when the play is over, then of course there's a period of rest, but basically what's happening is you're utilizing a lot of anaerobic sources, because typically football is really more of kind of a sprintish sort of like episodic type of activity. However, there is some endurance in football, of course, right? Because we all have watched many games. I know Broncos fans have watched many games where your team is doing well, and then the fourth quarter, it just feels like your players are gassed. They can't do anything anymore. They don't have any endurance because they've been doing everything on fast twitch, and now they've exhausted all of those energetic sources, and they don't have any enduring build up, any kind of endurance to basically last all 60 minutes. That's where your conditioning comes in to play. And so that's kind of basically how your body works. Normally, when you're working out, what'll happen is, because slow twitch is oxygen driven, fast twitch typically is not. What'll happen is, as you say, start jogging for your workout, what'll happen is your body starts to move, first of all, and starts to consume the anaerobic sources of energy that you have. Why? Because you simply don't have oxygen enough to support what you're doing. Remember, when you first start jogging and working out, your body is calibrated to essentially supply enough oxygen and nutrients to you for what your body needed when you were laying down or when you were at rest. Now, all of a sudden, you're starting to kick in all of these fast twitch and slow twitch, depending on what you're looking at, but you have a huge oxygen depletion here. And so you don't really have the physiology at the moment to support this kind of oxygen demanding type of endurance activity, which is mostly centered around slow twitch musculature. And so what you do then is you basically will supply your muscles with anaerobic sources over the short term, just to cover you while your lungs are busy trying to build up enough oxygen to switch you over to the more enduring slow twitch strategy. And so that's basically where we kind of get our breathing conditioning occurring. Most muscles will have both types. So it's not like you have a muscle that is fast twitch and a muscle that is slow twitch. You typically have muscles that are a combination of the two. So while you're working out and you're starting the process of working out, what happens is those muscle fibers that are in your muscle that are fast twitch are the ones that are dominant. Listen, fast twitch doesn't mean fast, right? It doesn't necessarily mean that you only have like your sprinter muscle fibers and then your marathon muscle fibers. And when you're running a marathon, you will never use your sprinter muscle fibers. It's actually better understood as muscle fibers that will basically be fueled in physiological scenarios when you don't have enough oxygen to support the enduring slow twitch musculature, right? So you're running on fast twitch at the beginning. When your oxygen kicks in, then you switch to slow twitch, and you have more endurance. That's one of the reasons why also you warm up, is to get that oxygen level going so that you can move to that endurance slow twitch as quickly as possible. So most of these will have both types. So when you take a look then at exercise, when you exercise, basically what's going to happen is you're going to change the size of your muscle fibers, right? So you get to hypertrophy, which is the increase in muscle size. And this is due because of the increase in myofibrils, not because of the increase in the muscle itself. And so you'll increase your nuclei. And so when you increase your nuclei, you fuse a type of cell called a satellite cell, which will fuse together and make a larger nucleus. And then what will happen is this will create, with an increased nucleus, better coordination of your muscles. It'll also allow you to be able to make better metabolic enzymes, because you need to feed those muscle fibers at a higher level. It'll give you better circulation, and also it will basically reduce fat as well. Now, atrophy is the decrease in muscle size. So this is basically the reverse of that, where essentially you lose muscle mass because you are reducing the number of myofibrils. And this is in each fiber. Now, the thing is, there's normal hypertrophy and atrophy. We talked a little bit about this one last time, right? So basically, when you're building up your muscles, you're adding more myofibrils. That's hypertrophy, and that's normal. And then, like, say, for instance, if you stop lifting, then you don't have the same load on your muscles, so you don't need those extra myofibrils. So you basically break them down, and that's atrophy. Now, there's also a type of atrophy that's basically an age-related atrophy, where you have the reduction in myofibrils as you age because it's harder to maintain myofibrils as you get older. Like, for instance, men over the age of 40 will experience a much more challenging process of trying to maintain muscle mass because physiologically they start to move into a state of muscular atrophy where their muscles slowly start to reduce in size and reduce the number of myofibrils. Part of that is, I'm going to recapitulate this as well when we get to the end of the chapter and talk about the aging effects of the muscular system. But part of the reason why there's age-related atrophy after the age of 40 is because after the age of 40, first of all, you need to understand that the body is, this sounds terrible, but biologically, the body basically wants to maintain your body long enough for you to reproduce, right? Because as a biological organism, that's kind of like the holy grail. That's like the purpose of an organism is to reproduce. And so once you've reproduced, then it's kind of like, well, you're just eating resources. And so at that point, the body feels less urgency to maintain your body because the idea is by the time you're 40 is the average animal will have reproduced and will have had success that way. And so a lot of times these systems will naturally start to diminish after the age of 40. In one case we learned with bone physiology is that we also have a diminishment in bone mass and bone integrity. And to go along with that diminishment of bone mass and bone integrity, we also have a diminishment of musculature and natural age-related atrophy. The idea being that you don't want this big hulking muscle that can produce this massive amount of force on a bone when it's attached to a bone that has been so riddled with osteoporosis because it's an aging old bone that it's going to create, well, breakage problems, right? So your physiology is kind of sort of ramping down your musculature to sort of in part be sort of in balance with the natural diminishment of bone mass and bone density as we get older. However, just because you have muscles when you're in your 70s doesn't necessarily mean you're going to break all your bones, right? So it's kind of a relative scale. Okay. Now, let's take a look at the muscle's ability or the muscle's role in heat production. So when you exercise, we all know this, we get hot, right? So our metabolic rate and our heat production increase massively. If you're actively working out and you're actively athletic, you'll notice that your appetite gets very big. That's because you're feeling your higher metabolic rate. You also get very hot, right? And so you have to excess and shed that excess heat that's basically being produced by your muscles, your working muscles. So oftentimes after exercise, after you stop exercising, that metabolic rate will stay high. And this is due to what's called oxygen debt. So basically this is a fancy term for your respiratory system returning to a non-exercise state. The excess heat that you have, and a lot of times, like, I don't know about you guys, when you're working out, a lot of times the hottest point you feel is when you stop working out, because now all of a sudden you feel all this heat coming off of your body. And the heat is coming from the vasodilation of those blood vessels in your skin. And that hot blood, remember, blood is hot. That hot blood that's in those vessels is heating up the sweat, and the sweat is taking the heat away from the body. That keeps your core body temperature from overheating. On the flip side of that, you also have the cold response. For instance, if you basically get too cold, that is to say, if your core body temperature drops, then what's going to happen is the muscle fibers will start shaking and contracting in an involuntary way, uncoordinated contraction. So this is involuntary contraction. That's designed to create heat. So you create that heat and you're going to warm up your body because your skeletal muscles is basically the primary place where you actually create most of your body heat. And so that's basically how your muscles are involved in that heat regulation and the core heat regulation of your body. So what about some energy sources for muscle contraction? We already talked about a couple in general, right? We talked about oxygen related versus anaerobic types of sources. Skeletal muscle fibers have a couple of major ATP dependent enzymes, right? For instance, the first one that we're going to run into is myosin. We've already seen that one at play. There's also the sodium potassium pump, right? That's the one that's basically maintaining the resting membrane potential. That's an ATP requiring enzyme. And of course, the calcium channel for the reuptake of calcium to pack it back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum for the next action potential. All three of these are ATP requiring. But the problem is muscle fibers in them only have enough ATP for maybe a few seconds of contraction. So you need to make more. And so when you take a look at needing to make more, you basically have to figure out different pathways or different ways of making more. So ATP is the immediate energy for your muscle contractions. You got to have it, right? You need all three of these in order to contract your muscle. You need myosin heads to be able to attach and do the power stroke of the excitation contraction coupling strategy. You need the sodium potassium pumps to set up the sodium concentration gradients that will basically propagate the action potential in the sarcolemma. And you need the calcium pumps to be able to set up the calcium efflux associated with triggering the shortening of the sarcomeres and the sliding filament model. So all three of those are necessary for the contraction of the muscle. So how do you produce it? There's a couple of ways to produce it. First of all, you can basically use an enzyme called adenylate kinase. And what adenylate kinase will do is it'll take two ADPs and it'll basically convert it into one ATP and an AMP, which is adenosine monophosphate. So that's one way to generate ATP. It's kind of like a side hustle, if you will, for ATP production. It doesn't produce a lot of ATP, but it can produce a little bit in a pinch. The other one that you're going to see is creatine kinase. So this is basically one that is going to take a phosphate from a creatine kinase, and it's going to add that to an ADP in order to form ATP. And so just to clarify something, we have a couple of different terms here. The term kinase, a kinase is a generic type of family. This is basically a protein family. There's a lot of different kinases out there that adds a phosphate to another molecule, usually another enzyme. So in this particular case, for instance, this creatine kinase is basically going to add its phosphate to ADP. So that's another way to kind of create a quick and cheap supply of ATP. And then you have an anaerobic respiration. So this is basically where you don't have any oxygen, but ultimately you'll break down glucose and you'll generate ATP and lactic acid. This is basically the fermentation pathway. You may have remembered that from general biology. We actually did a lab in the general biology lab 1090 where we actually did fermentation, or we did fermentation in yeast, but we also mentioned that fermentation in humans basically generates lactic acid. Now, lactic acid buildup in your muscles will give you a little bit of a burn in your muscles. And so that's that burning sensation that you feel in your muscles before your oxygen kicks in when you first start working out. And then what'll happen is that'll basically dissipate and go away. And then and then you'll be replaced by good aerobic respiration, which is the gold standard, right? This is the one that requires oxygen, and it's going to break down glucose to produce a lot of ATP, and the byproducts will be carbon dioxide and water. This is what we breathe out. But it doesn't just produce ATP, it produces lots of ATP. This is your high output process. Much more efficient than anaerobic. This is one of the reasons why you want to breathe when you work out. This is kind of what it looks like in pictures. So here's your adenylate cyclase. So you can see your adenylate kinase. So here you can see your adenylate kinase will basically take two of these ADPs and basically smash them together to create an ATP and an AMP. Then creatine kinase basically is a creatine phosphate group. So you have a creatine phosphate. And then what'll happen is it'll basically use the phosphate from this and basically smash it onto an ADP. And that'll basically turn it into an ATP. And then what you have left over is a creatine. And then typically what'll happen is you have a source or a mechanism, another metabolic pathway that will basically recharge this creatine back into creatine phosphate. Okay, it looks like PowerPoint is getting ready to crash on me here. Then the anaerobic pathway, so you take a glucose molecule, you go through glycolysis. Okay, hold on one second. Let me just go ahead and put PowerPoint out of its misery here and restart it. We're waiting for that to kick in. Does anybody have any questions? Are we all feeling good? Okay, so in the aerobic pathway, we're going to take a molecule of glucose. We're going to go through the glycolysis process to generate pyruvate, which then we will convert to lactate. And then in that process, we'll generate some ATP. And then the gold standard is aerobic. So for instance, if we go through glycolysis, then we go through pyruvate, and we go through the mitochondria and electron transport chain. You guys remember that probably from your energetics chapters in general bio. We're going to generate some like 36 to 38 ATP. We can go for hours with aerobic pathway. So this is the gold standard. This is, by the way, one of the reasons why doctors will always tell you to exercise at a level where you can hold a conversation with somebody. They don't care about what you're talking about or that you even talk to somebody. What they figure out is if you can hold a conversation with somebody while you're working out, then you're going to be breathing and you're going to be taking enough oxygen to maintain and keep that really good, efficient aerobic respiration going on. So this is also helpful to know, especially when you're working out, because if you just start really just like going after it and kind of beating yourself up with the workout, you're likely going to be dropping yourself into an anaerobic state, which is highly inefficient. So what you want to do is you want to kind of back off the stress. You want to back off the strenuousness of the workout and make sure that you're breathing really efficiently and that you're getting good oxygen. You're going to get a better workout and you're going to be able to go for a much longer period of time. So muscle fatigue is basically what happens when your muscles start to kind of get maxed out. They decrease their ability to do work. They reduce their efficiency of performance, and they're just basically overworked, right? So ultimately, when you take a look at muscle fatigue, you can oftentimes drop into an acidosis type of a scenario where you can consume ATP, you exhaust yourself of ATP. Either you use it all up or you have a decreased ATP production. So what would happen there? So sometimes what would happen there is if you just switch your metabolic pattern from an oxidative type of an aerobic to a more anaerobic situation. And you can do this a lot of times when you don't even realize it. Like for instance, I finally figured out when I'm doing this on my bike. Like for instance, if I just basically catch a good basal rhythm in terms of my cycling, I'm not going for speed. I just have a gear that I'm comfortable with and it's not too challenging. It's not pushing me too hard, but it's not certainly too easy as either. But I have a good rhythm in terms of my cycling, then oftentimes that'll favor aerobic respiration. Then when I attack a hill, when I have to sort of push harder, I'll notice there's a little bit of burn in my quads. That's the lactic acid buildup, because what I've done physiologically is I've shifted from a more aerobic sort of a strategy now to a more anaerobic strategy. And my muscles are starting to get a little fatigued because of the extra depletion of ATP. I'm kind of switching to this decreased ATP production strategy because I'm going anaerobic in this case. Oxidative stress is a situation where you have the buildup of these reactive oxygen species, like for instance, we call those ROS. So they're free radicals. They're also what's called superoxides. What these guys are, these are the byproducts of oxygen use, right? So you probably remember this from your cell chapter in general bio. This is something that basically these byproducts of oxygen build up in your system, and you have to have antioxidants in your system to be able to sort of defang or to detoxify these oxidative molecules. Oftentimes your cells will have peroxisomes in them that will have enzymes that defangs or detoxifies these very reactive species or reactive oxygen byproducts. But it helps to have a lot of antioxidants. So like for instance, taking and eating a lot of antioxidants or things like blueberries, pomegranates, things of that nature that will help you to kind of reduce oxidative stress. Now, this is basically when you just have a buildup of these species in there, and you can create oxidative stress in different scenarios, not just working out. It's not just an exercise thing. You can increase oxidative stress under a lot of different scenarios. And so that's why it's important to understand this. So usually very negative things happen when you do develop these and build up these reactive oxygen species. because they typically tend to be very negative on surrounding tissues. So the other thing you'll kick into is local inflammatory reactions. So for instance, if you have a state of fatigue where you have a lack of ATP, this is called this leads to a situation where you have what's called physiological contracture. This is where you have neither contraction nor relaxation occur. It's like a seizing of the system. Your engine just seizes up and it doesn't work anymore. And so that's one particular outcome of overall fatigue. And then you also have psychological fatigue as well. This is the most common type. Basically, this is essentially where your central nervous system is the one that's getting worn down rather than the actual muscles themselves. Okay, so you basically can have fatigue on a lot of different levels. One of the important things to understand is when you're working out, especially when you're working out, is to be smart about your body, is to work your body out because your body loves to work, but also to be smart about your workout. When you feel like your body is starting to get fatigued, when you feel like your muscles are starting to suffer, then the idea is to just back off and attack it a different day. Sometimes I have fatigue and I can't ride my bike because I ride my bike 3 times a week. But there's some days where it's like, I don't, my body is not there. My muscles are too fatigued, or there's a little bit of strain in my muscles. And so rather than pushing my muscles with a workout, I give them a day off. I give them a day of rest, and I give my mind a day of rest, because the idea is it's better to work out over the long term than it is to work out today. So I always look at my workouts that way. I ask myself, I gauge my body, I ask my muscles. I don't ask my muscles, it's like I'm talking to them, right? But the idea is I gauge, like, where are my muscles now? How fatigued are they, right? Is it really necessary to do the workout today? And if I do, will I injure myself? And then basically mean that I'm going to have to convalesce for a longer period of time? Or is it smarter to give myself a day of rest so that I can continue to work out for longer periods of time? For me personally, I like to ride my bike into December. And especially in the winter months, when the months start getting colder and I'm getting closer to the end of my season, I will take days off so that I can extend my season as deeply as I can into December. So I'd rather take a day off of exercise today if it means that I can extend my workouts deep into the season. And so you always have to play the long game. Be mindful of your body and be kind to your body, right? There's no glory in destroying your body. So I want to, this is the last one I want to talk a little bit about, is rigor mortis and, of course, soreness. So in rigor mortis, this is basically a post-mortem condition that is temporary. So it doesn't last forever. So this is essentially where you start getting rigid muscles several hours after death. And the reason for this is the calcium leaks out of, not into the sarcoplasm, or leaks into the sarcoplasm out of the sarcoplasmic reticulum, the SR, into the sarcoplasm, and it basically attaches to the myosin and essentially makes those cross bridges. And so essentially you also don't have any more ATP. Being made to detach the myosin heads. So you're dead. You're not making any more ATP, so that's not around to detach your myosin heads. Not only that, but you're not maintaining your calcium levels in your sarcoplasmic reticulum, so they're leaking out into the sarcoplasm, and this is creating like a perpetual contraction type of a scenario where you have perpetual cross bridge formation. And then eventually what's going to happen is it ends once the tissue starts to deteriorate. Basically what's going to happen is the degradation of the tissue will essentially cause the structure of the cross bridges to essentially fall apart, and then they'll detach on their own eventually. And that's kind of like what happens when the tissue starts to degrade. Soreness basically is a situation where you have an influx of these inflammatory chemicals that basically goes into the muscle fibers because the injury has increased the permeability of the plasma membrane of the muscle fibers, or has ruptured them. So essentially, it's like an inflammation response. So a little bit of soreness is okay. You can recover from that, but a lot of soreness is not, right? So that's just basically inflammation of your muscle fibers as they're basically trying to sort of reconstitute themselves from having been ruptured, at least in terms of the plasma membranes themselves. Okay, so since it is already our witching hour, what I want to do is I will start with this particular slide here, oxygen deficit and post-exercise oxygen calibration. And then we'll finish off the rest of the chapter next time, and we'll get a healthy start on chapter 11, which is going to be neurophysiology. Sound good?